Today is October 11th, the anniversary of the 1776 Battle of Valcour Island, or Benedict Arnold saves New York. I know some of you might think that sounds crazy. We only remember Benedict Arnold as the traitor he was. 1780, Benedict Arnold betrayed America and became a traitor. But there's a lot more to the Benedict Arnold story, especially the beginning of the story in 1775, 1776, 77, 78. A very complicated story that then leads him to do what he did later. As historians, what we always want to do is look at the full story of what happened, not what we want to have happened or not what we imagine has happened. But we want to look at the whole story of what happened because the purpose is to try to understand events and people so that we can make better decisions in our lives now. So Benedict Arnold, like many people, is a complicated person. I mean, you're not all one thing or all the other, and neither am I. And, I think in time, people come to realize that we're all complex people. But in 1776, Benedict Arnold was one of the finest commanders, if not the finest commander in the American Army. Now, I've been talking about the Battle for New York since August when it began, and it's still going on. Next week, I'll have a video about the next battle, which is Powell's Point on October 18th. But today, there's a battle in the upper Hudson, actually, it's Lake Champlain, that still has a bearing on the Battle for New York going on in New York City. So if you remember, in 1776, the British are trying to take Manhattan Island to use as a forward operating base. They also want Manhattan Island because of its strategic position, right? You can sail right in from the Atlantic Ocean, and from there you can go up the East River and out to the Long Island Sound, giving access to the North Shore of Long Island and New England, and then also up the other side of Manhattan Island, the Hudson River, straight up into the interior. So key to this plan is also taking command of the Hudson River, and the Hudson goes a lot further north than New York City. Now, the British in 1776 have a base in Montreal. You might remember we fought them 1775 in Montreal and won, but by now that's occupied by the British again. Later in 1775, in December, we also fought them at Quebec, a valiant effort on the part of Benedict Arnold. Again, Benedict Arnold facing off against the English in Quebec. And one of the things we don't learn in school is that Arnold led his men from New England to Quebec on foot to get there. On the way, they lost most of their supplies. He went out with his own money and procured supplies. A number of men who were sick, he even paid for lodgings for them to stay until he could retrieve them on the way back. It's an incredible story. You can see the whole story in a great documentary that's on Amazon Prime called Benedict Arnold, Hero Betrayed. And that'll give you more idea into what Arnold did in 1775 at Quebec. Quebec was a lost battle. You might know that New York commander Major General Richard Montgomery was killed in that battle. It was a very tragic event for the Americans. And Arnold was also shot in the leg. He was wounded in the leg. Arnold comes back, and then they call on him again in the fall of 1776 to stop the English who are on their way down from Canada to Lake Champlain. Now, if we look at this map of the Hudson River as it runs, all the way from the northernmost parts, which are near Lake George by our state capital of Albany, all the way down to New York City, you can see right around in there, there's a fort called Ticonderoga. And the British want to take Fort Ticonderoga. And they believe at that time the best way for them to do it is come from Canada. So Sir Guy Carleton, Canada, is going to launch a naval expedition that will come down through Lake Champlain and then on to Fort Ticonderoga, or so he hopes. Now, British have a magnificent navy, right? How are the Americans ever going to stop this expedition on Lake Champlain? They call Benedict Arnold because before Arnold was a great field commander, he was a merchant, a sea captain, and he spent his time going to the Caribbean on trips. He knew all about seafaring. He knew about building ships, commanding ships. He knew how to crew a ship. So they called on Arnold to help stop the British coming down Lake Champlain. Now, how are they possibly going to do this? The British have this great fleet of warships, and we have nothing. So they start building. And before I go on, I forgot to mention that another reason for wanting the Hudson River corridor is, as you can see from this map, to block off New England from the other colonies. So this will not only provide them transportation between their base in New York and their base in Montreal, but also will effectively cut off New England from the other colonies. So this becomes an incredibly strategic corridor in 1776. So now back to Valcour Island. Here's Lake Champlain. It's a big lake with a whole bunch of big islands, but you see there's a little island on the western side of the lake, and that's the New York side. The other side is Vermont, right? Lake Champlain between New York and Vermont. At that time, Vermont wasn't really Vermont yet. It was a contested area. New York claimed it as well as New England. So it's just kind of beside the point, but just to let you know, it wasn't Vermont at that time. So they can't face the British on Lake Champlain. That's simply not going to work. So Arnold comes up with an interesting plan. Well, first of all, they have to build some ships. And they have very little supplies. Nobody knows how to build a ship. They don't have any professional shipbuilders. But Arnold manages to get together the supplies and the men and instruct them well enough that they make 10 vessels. Not bad. So they have 10 of these smaller vessels to face off against this naval fleet. As I mentioned, they're not going to face off in the middle of the lake. Look at Valcour Island. There's a whole lot of water on the Vermont side or the east side, and there's a little narrow passageway on the New York side. Those of you who are fans of the 300 Spartans, what did Leonidas and the Spartans do? They made the Persians funnel down between what they called the hot gates, a very narrow passage, so that only a limited number of Persians could get through that pass and face the Spartan army at a time. So they couldn't spread way out in a formation. They had to get funneled down into a very narrow passage. So that's what Arnold is going to do here. He's going to take his 10 ships and put them in that little bay there and wait for the British to come down the Champlain. So they do. The British come down and they come around and they notice Arnold's fleet in that little area, and they turn to face them. Now, Arnold has also studied the currents and the wind, and he knows now that those British ships are going to be sailing into the wind. So they're not going to have as much power and maneuverability as they would out in that larger area. So we have this little narrow passageway here to face Arnold's ships. They also, once they get in there, can't turn around because of the wind. So the British have to use their smaller ships to face off against Arnold. And they have this incredible battle. Here are some great prints and paintings of the battle while I talk. Take a look at them. So the battle goes on for about 6 or 7 hours. But there's a brutal firing back and forth. Arnold himself running from gun to gun on his own ship, helping his men fire them and really keeping his men's spirits up. The guys on the other ship see what he's doing. They get into the fight, and the British terribly underestimate our forces in that little passageway. To make it worse, Native American Indian tribes on the shore are shooting at the Americans as well. And the Americans have cannon that are about 12-pound balls, while the British have cannon fired 24-pound balls. So totally outgunned, outshipped, outmanned, but hold them off for 6 to 7 hours until it gets dark. Let's take a look at those battle pictures one more time. And while we do, ask yourself, would you be able to do this? It's fall, it's October, the temperatures are starting to get cold on the lake, and you're building ships. You probably never built a ship in your life. There are lots of skilled craftsmen there working on these ships, but you're just following instructions. And then, would you be able to man those ships? Would you be able to get on one of those boats and face off against the British Navy? Really ask yourself, because this is what it took to be a patriot in 1776. So nightfall comes and the British decide they're going to try to blockade Arnold's ships in that little space. Arnold's officers don't want to continue, but he convinces them to try one more thing. They line up their ships in a single file with a lantern on the back of each ship so the one behind it can see the one in front. In single file, they begin moving out of that little space and down the New York side of Lake Champlain. Now, their caravan of ships is hidden in fog as they go through and pass very closely to the British naval ships. Well, the next morning, the British see they're not there and see them moving down the lake and decide to pursue them. The last ship in the line surrenders. Arnold at that time turned his ship around to face the British and engage them alone, allowing the rest of his ships to get away. And as Arnold is fighting them, bobbing and weaving all around in different directions, his other ships are doing their best to escape. Some of them run aground and the men get away, but most of them survive. Arnold's action allows the rest of his fleet to escape. Now, some of the guys are going to ground their ships and run away, but they escape. Arnold, at the end, runs his ship aground. They burn the ships they've left behind, and they all escape down to Fort Ticonderoga. Now, the British, you'd figure, will just follow them down to Ticonderoga, right? Well, no, it's October 11th. I'm not nearly that far north, and look, I have my little additional fireplace on here because it's cold. It's already cold here in northeastern Pennsylvania. It was getting very cold at Lake Champlain. And as a result, Guy Carleton decided not to try to mount an attack on Ticonderoga the rest of that year and went back to Canada. So now the British won't attack Ticonderoga until the following year, 1777. And that gives the Americans time to reinforce Fort Ticonderoga. So because of Arnold's incredibly brave actions at Valcour Island, it prevents the British from opening up the lower Hudson River, which they really need. And you know what? By the time Arnold commits his treason 4 years later in September of 1780, that corridor is still closed to the British. And you know what his treason was, right? Offering them West Point to open up that Hudson River corridor that he helped prevent them from taking 4 years before in the fall of 1776. So how is it that somebody who would do that, put himself in the line of fire for his men, and it's not the only time Arnold did that, and in total he's going to be wounded twice in the same lake, first at Quebec, later at Ticonderoga in 1777. How does he do that and then turn against those very men a few years later? It's a really hard thing to accept. So I understand why people try to leave out Benedict Arnold's decisive victories earlier in his career, because the betrayal is so incredible and so horrible and so difficult to comprehend. But the truth is, he did do these things also, and we need to take them into account when we look at the whole picture of the American Revolution. So I hope you enjoyed this. If you want to see more about the Battle of Valcour Island, you can check out Jack Kelly's book, Valcour. Also, the documentary that I talked about goes in depth into what happened there. I'm not a military historian, so I don't really talk about the details of battles that way. I'm more a historian about the social and political things that happened during the Revolutionary War, but the battles are important in view of all that as well. So for me, Valcour is important in what it does for the rest of the battle for New York, and that is keep the British from coming down the Hudson. So thanks very much for joining me, and I hope this kind of opens up your mind a little bit to that maybe Benedict Arnold isn't exactly who you thought he was. He was much more than what you probably think he was. And I encourage you to learn about everyone and learn about the way people make decisions and why they make decisions, and how maybe what we thought they were is not really who they were. And I'm going to be doing a whole lot of that in future videos. I'm going to do that with some people you probably really like from the Revolutionary War and show you they may not be the people you thought they were either. So thanks for joining me. If you'd like this, please like it, subscribe to my channel for more, share it, and if you're in a place like me where it's already cold, stay warm this beautiful fall in northeastern America. Until next time, I'm Mrs. Q.